Yeah, so me and Kyle are going to quickly do a walkthrough of the OutSystems system here, the Troy Hedge. Yeah, so the purpose of this recording is to be able to reproduce this thing and just to give a quick walkthrough to one other technical person so that we know what the so we basically know what the system does. Well, so one other person knows what the system does. All right, so let me quickly kick off here. Okay, so this whole system was built in a thing called OutSystems. So OutSystems is a no-code environment, basically, for very rapid iteration and code release. Yeah, so if I can quickly just take it from the side here. So OutSystems, basically, you have different environments. Environments typically consist of an environment lives inside of a pipeline, and a pipeline typically consists of like a development environment, a testing environment, and a live environment. And we're using the free version here, so all three of those are bundled into one. Yeah, so what we'll do is once this environment's implementation of the Hedge has been integrated by Kyle into Troy's system, we'll actually just clone this and run it on a separate environment as the live environment, and then we'll actually like load the relevant settings into that environment for live trading once we're satisfied that the thing does what it's supposed to do. All right, so inside of environments, we have applications, and applications consists of modules. So if we open this up, just go to Troy Hedge here. So this will just have the modules in there. So this thing only really has one module, which is the Troy Hedge API. I also built like a UI for Dane just in case it's necessary. But the more I think about it, the more it's like it'll likely not be necessary that he needs an API for the thing. But I'll do a walkthrough with him at some point as well, and then we can just see what he needs and doesn't need. Okay, so basically this system, it's in the back end, it's a .NET service that runs on AWS, and it pretty much stays live. So it's more of a classical service running there. So it's not a microservice-based thing. Yeah, this module doesn't have any front end. So it only consists out of three categories, basically, which is the data that I'll do a walkthrough of now, the logic. The logic sort of has two parts to it. The one part is all the internal server actions, which is what actually makes the system tick over. And then it has the integrations. So the integrations are specifically the execute trade and the get trade offer. Those are really the only two external pointing API endpoints that are of serious consequence here. I built a bunch also under a separate API called testing. That's just so that the tests can run, so that it can actually query the state of the system. Yeah, so that's something in the live system that we'll probably turn off as well. Yeah. Okay, and then we basically have processes. So processes are things that are sort of like process flow managers. None of that we really implemented except, well, none of that we really needed except for timers, right? So you'll see here that there's a couple of timers. The one is execute triangular hedge trade, which I'll explain when I get there. And then the other one is basically consolidate gold positions and consolidate ZAR positions. Right, so if we jump over to the database, I'm going to just basically show you this entity diagram here. Okay, so the database, like it has a bunch of settings and a few logs. The two settings essentially have to do with the hedge minimums, right? And the hedge minimums are configuration that's necessary for IG markets, right? So that typically, this table just essentially contains an auto incrementing ID. It contains which asset we're trading, what that asset is denominated in, which is a little bit of a subtle thing that I had to figure out there. It basically has a deposit factor. So in other words, what is the maximum amount of leverage that we're willing to run against our collateral? right? So the deposit factor, for instance, on IG markets is 0.05. So that gives us leverage of 20x, although I've set it here to be 0.1. So we have a maximum of 10x leverage. So that makes sure that we can never get a margin call or anything. Well, we should theoretically never get a margin call. Yeah. And then we have the contract sizes and the minimum contract purchase. So in other words, these CFD the CFD contracts have they've sort of like got a size, and the size is how much of the asset you have to buy in that contract. And then there's a minimum contract purchase. So you can, for some of these contracts, you can buy like a fraction of a contract, for instance. Okay, so let me open that up quickly just so that I show you what's going on there. All right, so currently there's only two things in here. So so some of this stuff I tried to keep fairly configurable, but I opted not to go for full configurability, just purely for the sake of expedience. But I did try to leave the basics in place so that if we want to iterate on it going forward and have more asset types, et cetera, that we could then move to a fully configured system. All right, so currently there's only really two settings loaded here. So the one is where the asset is gold and the denominating asset is USD. Right, so in other words, that's gold denominated in dollars, right? So the deposit factor there is 0.1, which if we invert that gives us a maximum leverage of 10x. The minimum contract purchase is 10. Now, Dane has negotiated a minimum contract purchase of 1 on their official account, but that's not something we can run with yet until we basically get to the live system. Right, the minimum contract, and then the contract size is 1, which means the asset being gold ounces, we have to buy 1 gold ounce per contract. Sorry, we have to buy so each contract is 1 gold ounce, but we have to buy and sell in batches of 10 basically. And then the currency code is this is a little, to be honest, this is a little confusing to me because neither USD nor ZAO here is what the currency code is involved in this demo market of mine, but it insisted on being GBP here. And for the other one, it insisted on being rand. So I'm not 100% sure how this factors into IG's working, but if I don't have it in there, it doesn't work, right? So and it only accepts one currency type. The second one is basically USD and ZAR. So the thing is, in our hedge, what happens if somebody buys gold, we have to basically buy contracts for gold against the US dollar, and we have to sell contracts for rands against the US dollar, right? So we have neither USD exposure nor gold exposure. We completely hedge to 0, right? So what's a little strange here is that this market is US dollars denominated in rands, right? So in other words, this is actually, we're buying and selling US dollars, but we're denominating them in rands, right? So our profit and our losses are calculated in ZAR. And the thing about that is, if you look at what happens on IG as this thing trades, it basically it goes in the same direction for both contract types, right? So conceptually, it's going in the opposite direction. Conceptually, for every 1 positive gold ounce we have, we should have 1 negative gold ounce rand amount in the opposite direction, right? But because the asset types are inverted here, so in other words, the USD is the asset and ZAR is the denomination, you'll see that what the system does is when it buys gold, it also buys a bunch of dollars, right? But it buys those dollars denominated in rands, and that's kind of like where the contract math then evens out. So buying dollars against rands is the same as shorting rands against the dollar in the other direction, right? So that's just something to keep in mind about how the system actually ends up functioning. All right, here there's quite a sizable minimum contract size. So the minimum we can do here on a contract is $10,000, and we have to purchase $1 at a time in either direction, right? So that kind of and for some reason, again, the currency code for this is not GBP, which is the base currency of my account, but ZAR for some reason on this market. Anyway, like I said, that doesn't seem to have any bearing on how it works. It just seems to be some requirement from IG's side. Okay, so this is essentially this is the configuration for working with IG. So moving forward, the idea is that this can then be expanded, that, if there's other things you want to hedge, and they've got Ether and Bitcoin, I mean, they've got hundreds of assets on there, that use a similar mechanism here. There's parts of the system that's more custom to the whole gold rand hedge, which are things that we have to run through. And then, sorry, another thing here is this field that says epic. The epic is basically that is the identifier code internal to IG for that market. So so that just says which market we're trading against. So some asset pairs, I'm assuming, has more than one epic associated to them, right? But these seem to be the only two for IG on the test system that I had. Okay. All right. Then the next thing is basically price settings. So price settings, that has to do with, do you have any questions on the previous thing, Carl?
No, I think you've explained that really well. Thanks for taking me through that.
Okay, cool. All right, so so the next one is basically price settings, and what the price settings have to do with is this actually sets what the how the price calculator, which is, so the system has two parts to it, really. Like, the one is the price calculator and the other one is the hedging system, right? So the price calculator, all it really does is it just goes and says, okay, well, of the last however much volume of trade, was I buy weighted or was I sell weighted, right? And that has to do with the terminal liquidity of the physical asset that they purchase. All right, so the way that the price settings are set up is, so it has a terminal selling price, which is 0, so which is essentially just that's the offset from the spot price, right? And there's a terminal buying of 0.45, so that's basically, if we're selling, we can sell at 0. If we're buying, we can buy at 0.045, right, or 4.5%. Right, and then I put in a trade volume window size here of 1,000, but we can adjust that basically. So all that does is that looks at the trade history, and it counts the last 1,000 ounces of trade, or 1,000 units of trade that happened for this asset, basically, right? And it then says, okay, well, buying versus selling, was I buy heavy or was I sell heavy? Right, so it just adds up all the trades, which I'll show in a little bit, and it so it adds up all the trades, and it just checks, like, is this number positive or negative? If it's negative, it means that I'm probably selling a bunch, and if it's positive, do I have the negative and the positive the right way around now? Yeah, sorry. If it's negative, I'm selling, basically. So in other words, I should offer the client 0. If the weighting is positive, I should offer the client 4.5 basically percent. All right, so this system doesn't take into account at all, I have mentioned this before as well, but it doesn't take your fees into account at all, your profits or anything to that effect. All it does is it gives you a price, right, that you should be charging, that you should be working from to charge the client, right? So any fees that this thing comes back with, you have to add your profit or subtract your profit in whatever direction the thing is going, right? The system only concerns itself with what should the price be and am I hedged correctly, right? So obviously what the system also does is it looks at all the trades, the buying and the selling, and keeps track of that and makes sure that we're hedged sufficiently, right? So in other words, that we have a sufficient amount of, if we're buy heavy, we're buying slightly more gold contracts. We're buying 4.5% more gold contracts than the actual gold will end up purchasing in the background, right? So we have to make sure we're that the price we're giving the client reflects what's being done in the hedge in the background as well, right? So yeah, so that's essentially what these settings do, is just basically tells us what is the terminal sell, the terminal buy, and over what window, what period do we look at that, right? So I mean that's also like a setting that you guys will have to decide on, is how large does that number have to be. Okay, so let's quickly go back here. All right, so then there's IG session data. So this is just something to prevent, because this system is really running on a partial VM over at Amazon, right? So if it has any performance issues, Kyle, just tell me, and then I mean, I've got one or two tricks that I think we can apply to just try and make it a little bit more speedy. But one of them that I just did out the outset is that the IG session data, once you log in via the API, gives you a session key that's valid, I think, for 6 hours. So all that this does is this just tracks when last did we log in and what's that session data, right? Which is then valid for 6 hours. And every time we try to do an API call, it just checks this table to see, have I logged in recently? If so, let me try log in quickly. All right, and then there is the trade consolidation log, and I'll get to what this does exactly in a bit. But one of the things that one of the devils in the details was that when I buy and sell the stuff on the front end, when I checked it initially, if I was long 20 ounces of gold and I tried to sell 11, like 5 ounces to 10 ounces of gold, it would automatically take my long position and trim it down by 10. But if I do the same thing via the API, it doesn't do that. It opens up a secondary position, which also consumes our margin, right? So that's obviously problematic, since that's like half the efficiency of what we could have had. So I had to build a thing that looks at all the consolidations, or it looks at all the positions and consolidates them into single positions, right? So that actually adds the -11 to the 20 and opens up a 9, for instance. Okay. And the thing is, if anything ever goes wrong there, which it really shouldn't, it really shouldn't go wrong there. But if anything ever goes wrong there, that's the kind of thing we want an error message for, right? So that then we at least want to know, like, okay, well, this thing fell over when we tried to, trade gold, when we tried to consolidate the gold positions, right? Because then from there, at least we can try and figure out, okay, well, hold on a second, our hedge is off here. We should open up a larger position or something to that effect. All right. So anyway, so I just thought it prudent to at a minimum log that type of stuff there. Okay. Yeah, so it's actually theoretically, if anything ever goes wrong with, if there's ever an entry here, like we should actually probably try to figure out why there's an entry there. Okay, so that's just essentially like logging and configuration. So now on the system itself, right? So on the system itself, what I store is I store the price quotes. So essentially, the price quote is just every time every time we ask the price from IG, I just decided that, listen, we're just going to store the price internally. So we just have an idea of who the price provider is. Now that can only really be IG. What the priced asset is, what the denominating asset is. So in other words, did we look for gold priced in dollars, for instance, or did we look for USD priced in rands? And then just what that price was. And the reason for that is just that we need to be able to say, listen, when we do a trade, what was the price we thought it was, right? And if so, then we can, then we have an idea of what was the price, right, for sanity checking. And if anything really ever goes massively wrong, we can go, okay, well, hold on a second. We were getting prices, but the prices were incorrect from X, Y, or Z. Right, so that's kind of relevant to the next table, which is the trade table. So the trade table is, so I opted not to go full normalization here, which I don't think you'll have like a problem with, because, you guys already, I think we live in the post SQL normalize everything world. But basically what I did here was, so this table is optimized more for readability than maybe directly for accounting. I solved some of the accounting stuff in custom queries elsewhere. But what this thing does is every time there's a trade, it looks at, obviously, when did it happen? It looks at the asset in, which is just, is it gold or is it rand coming in? For all purposes, those are the only two options. What's going out is gold or is it rands, right? Then how much are we getting in? Like, what is the amount coming in? And then basically, what is the amount going out? And then what is the spot deviation that we're charging for that trade, right? So that's essentially what the trade table is. And that table is used in conjunction with the price settings to determine if we're charging terminal sell or terminal buy to the client, right? And each trade also stores like, well, what did we charge? Did we charge 0 or 0.45. Right. So that specifically never really comes in, except if we for some reason have to unravel something that might go wrong. We'd want to know, like, listen, okay, cool. Are we charging the correct amount? Is that right? At that point in time, what would the system have charged? Right. Okay. But so that's essentially the trade table. So the trade table just tells us like what type of thing is coming in, what type of thing is going out, how much are we getting in, and how much are we sending out, right? And the in and out amount already contain what price it's for and what the spot deviation would have been, right? So that's the end goal. It's also similar to what the API endpoint looks like there for you. So in other words, you can just look at the numbers and use them. You don't have to. You have to do minimal additional calculation to figure out anything there. Okay. Then on the right-hand side here, basically, and I'll get to the middle one here. On the right-hand side, we have a hedge trade, right? So what a hedge trade does is, obviously the system tracks, trade for gold against rands and rands against gold the whole time, right? So what the hedge trade table does is it tracks every time we go to the backend CFD provider and we open up a hedge, right? So where the trade table is, so where the trade table basically like takes two assets and accounts for them and sort of like flips the tables around, which is a little bit of a challenge to do, looking at a query later on. But this thing essentially just takes one asset at a time, and it just tells us what amount of that asset are we hedging in or out, basically, right? So that just tells us, like, listen, we hedged positive a bunch of gold, or we hedged negative a bunch of gold, or we hedged positive a bunch of rands, or we hedged negative a bunch of rands, right? So that's the only thing that happens there, right? So in the middle, there's a table which is the hedge imbalance table, right? So what the hedge imbalance table does is every time there's a trade or every time there's a hedge trade, it calculates, because we can't hedge each small trade on IG because there's minimum transaction sizes, right? So each time a trade comes in, what we basically do is each time a trade comes in, we accumulate in the hedge imbalance table how much of an imbalance is there, and is the imbalance large enough to justify a hedge trade. Right. So the trades accumulate in the hedge imbalance. So the number there goes up and down and up and down and up and down. But once it goes over a certain threshold, right, for both gold and the rand, right? So in other words, the rand amount has to be larger. The rand amount is larger than the gold amount. So once the imbalances for both are large enough to justify a hedge trade, then a hedge trade actually gets executed. Right. And then we can essentially say, okay, well, cool, we're now completely hedged out. We've got no currency risk. But we do carry currency risk for whatever is in the hedge imbalance table, right? So as long as that, well, there's going to be a negative or a positive number there pretty much all the time. And whatever the price fluctuations are is, that's what we're on the hook for. But strictly speaking, we should be on the hook for about 17,000 rands, give or take, of rand exposure, and about is it 17,000, or do I have it wrong now? Yeah, I think it's about 17,000 rands worth of rand exposure and about 32,000 rands worth of gold exposure at any given point in time, given the minimums that they've done, right? So so I'm assuming that should be very, very minimal given given the normal price fluctuation of gold. Okay. Yeah. So essentially also, if we add up, if we have to transform this table a little bit to get the math right, but if we add up all the trades that happen for a specific asset here, and we subtract them from all the trade that happened here, and we then subtract this number, we should get to 0. Right. So I wrote a little thing that is just called it's just invariant hedge imbalance nets out. So that's all that basically does. So this little query just checks, listen, if we just did what I just described, which is, let me just open up that thing for you again here. So if we if we add everything in the asset year, we subtract it from everything year, and then we subtract this number as well, then we get to 0, right? So, and as long as that's the case, we know we're in good shape, right? So, so yeah, hold on a second. Okay, it looks like we're going to run out in 10 minutes, but we'll start another one. Okay. Do you want to have a look at this, or do you, okay, cool.
No, I'm fine. That makes sense.
All right. Any questions up to this point?
No, I think that's a really clear explanation. I like the particularly the kind of the trade, the hedge trade, the trade imbalance, and your kind of next to 0 explanation. I think that was really clear. I think that the one question I've got that relates to the hedge trades and the consolidation trade log is how are the CFDs managed in the question of like when do those contracts close?
Well, they, as far as I understand, they remain open, and they charge daily interest. So at the end of the day, they charge an interest based on the amount of margin that you. Well, okay, so there would be 2 factors. The one is basically like you would pay some interest on the margin, and there'd be some interest on the contract itself. So yeah, so there'd be some interest there, but they don't close. The contracts remain open until you close them.
Okay, and here in this one, what action triggers the closing of a contract? Is there kind of only one hedge trade open at any one given time? Do you kind of close the last one as soon as you're about to open the next one? Or what sort of triggers the closing of a hedge?
Okay, so let me go to that now quickly. All right, so the processes that happen here. So the first thing is this thing called execute triangular hedge, right, which runs on a timer. The timer is currently set for about every 15 minutes for the times that those 2 markets are open, right? So Monday to Friday, it has a little bit of strange times. I don't know how they got to these times, but like Saturday, most of Saturday and almost as much of Sunday is closed. And then there's like 1 hour where it's closed, right? Which is also a little bit of an annoyance because it's 1 hour. It's closed during 1 hour in British time, but with daylight savings in it as well. So it's like,
oh God, yeah,
that was an annoyance.
Yeah,
but
that's tricky.
Yeah, that's tricky. So my approach to that was not to deal with it. It just assume that for 2 hours, like I can't trade, right? But I don't really think that would be anything of any sort of issue, really. But so basically, we have this timer called execute triangular hedge, and that calls this execute triangular hedge, right? So what this does is, so it does a few things, right? If the hedge imbalance is messed up, it won't try to do the hedge, right? Because if the hedge imbalance is too far off, then that means that we've made a mistake somewhere. We're going to start, incurring leveraged, like currency risk. So if the hedge imbalance invariant check doesn't check out for gold or for the rand, basically, yeah, if it doesn't check out for gold or for the rand, then it'll raise an exception and it'll log it internally, right? So we'll see that, listen, it's not actually like opening that up, right? And then what it'll do basically is, if both of those are correct, then what it'll do is it'll call this thing here called, so I tried to split this stuff up a little bit into CQRS, just so that I can actually see what it does before it actually ends up doing it. So it'll call this thing called get triangular hedge. So all that get triangular hedge does is it calculates based on the current imbalance and all the trades that have happened. Can I open up a hedge, right? So in other words, is there enough of an imbalance for both rands and the gold for me to open up 2 positions? And then it comes back with what those position sizes needs to be, right? And it also tells you like, can you perform this thing or not? So it gives you the settings and it does the calculation of telling you, yes, IG will accept this, or no, you're not going to be successful there. So then what it does is it opens up the gold position first. If the gold position fails, then the whole calculation reverts atomically, right? if that succeeds, it basically opens up, because now this is external to the system. So if that succeeds, we can no longer assume we can fail atomically, right? Because if that part succeeds, then we have a gold hedge now on the other side. Okay, so then what happens basically is, yeah, so then we try to open, okay, so these actions just basically update the hedge imbalance. And then over here, we have open USD ZAR position, right? So what this does is just, this now goes to IG and opens up the RAND position as well. Now, for whatever reason that fails, we can't fail atomically. So we just actually like commit what the database has updated. So all we'll see there basically is, oh, we only had one hedge trade, right? So in other words, there's still some amount that is now excessively accumulated for the RAND because the gold hedge like went through. Now that should never happen. But if it does, that's fine, because the things, the accounting will take that into account, and it won't open up any positions we don't want, which is pretty much the worst thing I guess that could happen with the system. Okay, if that succeeds, it just updates the hedge imbalance for it just updates the hedge trade table, and it then updates the hedge imbalance table as well. Right. So what these two actions do is they update the contracts at IG. Right. So that open USD ZAR position and that open XAU USD position. Right. So they make new contracts there. Now, the way that IG, like I described earlier, for some reason, they keep adding them instead of editing them. You know, at least when I use the normal stuff, I guess if they really, anyway, I'll get to how that gets resolved. I suspect it will be a non-issue, the fact that they open up multiple ones, right? And the reason for that is just I don't know if you guys will see sufficient trade for this thing to become an issue in between when the second timer runs, right? So the second timer is the second two timers are this thing called consolidate all XAU positions and consolidate all ZAR positions. So essentially all that this thing does is it gets the net position for an asset type. Then it gets the minimums. It checks, listen, is the net position yeah, so is the net position plus the position that we either have to additionally open or close, is that big enough to execute? If it's not big enough, just end. It's not a problem. If it is big enough, basically, then what happens is, sorry, I explained that badly. Okay, so what this thing basically does is it looks at all the net positions, right? And it looks at, is the net position large enough to be a position on its own? Right. If it is large enough to be a position on its own, then consolidate that whole position. Right. If it's not, just wait until it is, basically. So, all right. So that gets the net position. If it's successful or if it's big enough, then it basically goes, okay, well, close all the positions. Right. So now it takes all those positions and it starts closing them down. Right. And then once it's closed them all down, it opens up a new net position. Basically, that's the size that is the size directionally that the difference between the two sets of positions was. Right. Yeah. So that's what these two functions do. And then it just checks, like it checks the response from IG. If that was unsuccessful, that we really need to know about, right? Because that means that we've now dislocated our hedge rather badly, right? So that throws an exception, and then that exception is caught by this piece of code over here, which basically just, it catches the exception and it logs what went wrong, right? So that's just kind of the thing that once we run it in testing, we just have to have a look. Like there shouldn't be anything in that log table. I'm fairly confident there won't be anything in that log table. Yeah, I'm fairly confident there won't be anything in that log table. And then the primary reason just for that is, I mean, I really think we need to hit this thing with rather severe volumes, to the degree where it literally opens up multiple hedges per second for this to even be able to go wrong. So I just don't see that as a, I mean, yeah, I don't really see that as a problem. But we do at least monitor whether or not that could be a problem. Does that answer the question? I know I said a lot now since your question.
No, I think this is a really good answer, and that's making sense. Thanks for taking me through that.
Okay. All right, cool. So yeah, so basically the two timers, let's just go to the logic here. All right. So just from the let me actually start from where you would hit the system, and then we take it back from there. Right. So the one thing is you would hit the get trade offer. So get trade offer is this function that all it really does is you give it some